Imagine sitting in a packed courtroom where every whisper and glance carries the weight of a life-changing trial. Suddenly, a defiant young man, calm and unflinching, stands up and begins dismantling the prosecution's case with the precision of a seasoned attorney, leaving even the judge visibly shaken. And later, on a sunlit highway in Sacramento, a routine traffic stop spirals into a high-stakes confrontation where a man reveals his true authority in a way no one expected. These are not just isolated incidents, they are two powerful stories that force us to question the very systems we trust. Stay tuned as we unfold these riveting encounters that challenge injustice, expose bias, and remind us all that sometimes the truth comes from the most unexpected places. Part 1: The Courtroom Confrontation. The atmosphere inside the Los Angeles County Courthouse was almost tangible, a heavy mix of anticipation and disbelief. Rows upon rows of spectators leaned forward in their seats, their whispers merging into a low hum that seemed to vibrate off the polished walls. At the center of it all was a young defendant whose calm resolve defied every expectation. Judge Marcus Reynolds, known for his steely demeanor and no-nonsense approach, had expected to deal with another troubled teen. His eyes, hidden behind a pair of thin-rimmed glasses, glinted with a mixture of contempt and amusement as he surveyed the courtroom. Across the aisle stood Caleb Monroe, a 19-year-old accused of grand theft auto and resisting arrest. Caleb, with his hands casually tucked into his pockets and his chin raised in defiant confidence, exuded a quiet assurance that belied his age. Reynolds cleared his throat and leaned back in his oak-paneled bench, drumming his fingers lightly against the smooth wood. "You think you're some kind of legal expert?" he drawled, his voice laced with sarcasm. "This isn't a debate club, kid." A ripple of laughter, half mocking, half incredulous, swept through the courtroom. Even the bailiff, the stenographer, and the stern-faced prosecutor, Edward Hughes, couldn't help but smirk at the apparent audacity of the young man before them. But Caleb wasn't laughing. In fact, he was anything but flustered. He had spent years quietly preparing for this moment. While most of his peers were busy memorizing sports statistics or engrossed in video games, Caleb's life had been steeped in the world of law. Raised by his mother, Rebecca Monroe, a former paralegal with over 20 years of experience, Caleb had grown up absorbing courtroom stories, witnessing firsthand the shortcuts taken by prosecutors and the leniency often granted by judges. By the time he was 14, he could analyze a trial with the insight of many law students. Yet, to Judge Reynolds, he was merely another kid in trouble. "Let's make this quick," Reynolds announced with a dismissive sigh as he flipped open the case file. "I have a golf game at 2. His nonchalant remark drew more chuckles from the gallery. But in that brief moment, something shifted. Caleb's lips curled into a nearly imperceptible smirk, a subtle sign that the judge had just made his first mistake. As the courtroom buzz began to quiet, Prosecutor Hughes rose with an air of rehearsed confidence. With his tie perfectly knotted and his suit pressed to perfection, he began his opening statement. "Your Honor, the state will prove beyond any reasonable doubt that the defendant, Caleb Monroe, was caught red-handed in a stolen vehicle, a sleek 2022 Aurora sedan that was reported missing mere hours before his arrest. Officers chased him through downtown, and his fingerprints were found on the steering wheel." His words, delivered with clinical precision, carried the weight of what seemed like undeniable evidence. Yet, beneath the surface, something did not add up. Reynolds peered over his glasses at Caleb before addressing Hughes with a dismissive, "Go on." The prosecutor strode toward the jury box, his polished shoes clicking authoritatively against the floor, as he continued to build his case. The defense might argue that this was all a misunderstanding, that Mr. Monroe is merely an unfortunate victim of circumstance, but let us be honest here, what kind of victim flees from the police? Tension mounted in the courtroom as the audience exchanged uncertain glances. Caleb remained unflinching, his eyes fixed straight ahead. Judge Reynolds tapped his gavel lightly. "Let us hear the defense's response." Up until that point, Caleb's public defender, a reserved attorney named Denise Carter, had spoken scarcely. But now, something unexpected happened. Caleb cleared his throat and, in a calm and steady voice, announced, "I will be representing myself." A stunned silence blanketed the room. Reynolds arched an eyebrow in amusement. "You're representing yourself?" Caleb's response was unwavering. "Yes, Your Honor. I intend to defend my case." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Even the bailiff's eyebrows shot up in surprise. Edward Hughes's confident smirk faltered ever so slightly before he recovered with a dismissive laugh, muttering, "This should be interesting." With a subtle yet purposeful step forward, Caleb began his defense. Adjusting his stance and letting the silence grow until it felt almost oppressive, he finally spoke again. "Before I begin, Your Honor, I'd like to confirm something with the prosecution." His measured tone drew a raised eyebrow from Hughes, who crossed his arms in a mix of irritation and disbelief. "You said Officer Grant Turner personally saw me behind the wheel prior to my arrest, correct?" Caleb inquired slowly. Hughes exhaled sharply. "That is correct, and it is recorded in his report." Caleb nodded, then turned his attention to Judge Reynolds. "Your Honor, I move to dismiss that testimony as evidence." Judge Reynolds squinted, trying to understand on what grounds Caleb could possibly challenge such testimony. For the first time, Caleb stepped away from his casual stance, his hands emerging from his pockets as he gestured toward the prosecution's table. "Officer Turner never actually saw me in that vehicle. In fact, he wasn't even on duty when the chase began." A murmur of disbelief grew louder among the gallery. Hughes's confident facade faltered. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, clearly rattled. Caleb took another deliberate step forward. "If the court will allow, I request that we verify Officer Turner's GPS logs from the night of the incident. If his report truly states he witnessed me behind the wheel, then his location history should confirm it, but I have a strong feeling it will not." The courtroom grew tense as every eye focused on Judge Reynolds. The judge frowned deeply and then turned to Hughes. "Does the prosecution have any objection to verifying the officer's GPS data?" Hughes hesitated a pause long enough for both the jury and the gallery to sense that the tide was beginning to turn. Finally, with a reluctant shake of his head, Hughes replied, "No objections, Your Honor." The shift in the atmosphere was palpable. For the first time, the courtroom's laughter faded into a heavy silence, and even the judge's previously confident smirk gave way to a look of measured uncertainty. Hughes, clearly struggling to regain control, shuffled his papers with a tension that betrayed his crumbling composure. "Your Honor, while we await the GPS records, let it be noted that the defendant's fingerprints were indeed found on the steering wheel." Caleb's face remained unreadable as he simply nodded in acknowledgement. But then, with a deliberate calmness that resonated through every corner of the room, he addressed the jury directly. "Ladies and gentlemen, the prosecution wants you to believe that finding my fingerprints on a car proves I stole it. But let me ask you, does merely touching something make you a criminal?" His analogy was simple yet piercing. Imagine you walk into a store, try on a jacket, and later, the jacket is reported stolen. Does your touch on that jacket mean you stole it? A few jurors exchanged glances, and a murmur of agreement could be heard from somewhere deep in the gallery. Caleb continued, his voice clear and commanding. "Hours before the alleged theft, the car in question was parked outside a convenience store. I was inside that store with 3 friends. We merely passed by the car. I even leaned against it and opened the door because it was unlocked. I did not steal anything. It was, in essence, a moment of curiosity, not criminal intent." His words sliced through the courtroom tension like a scalpel. "Does touching something really make you a criminal?" Hughes, desperate to regain the upper hand, flipped through his notes with growing frustration. "Your Honor, regarding the fingerprint analysis, wasn't he the forensic specialist from the case subpoenaed to testify?" Caleb's eyes locked onto the judge's, seeking clarity. Judge Reynolds blinked, caught off guard by the question. After a brief hesitation, he admitted, no. A small, determined smile crossed Caleb's face as he pressed on. So, let me be clear, the state is relying on forensic evidence to convict me, yet they did not bring in the actual specialist who processed this evidence. This denies me the opportunity to cross-examine, to question the chain of custody, or to challenge the accuracy of the analysis. His tone was neither angry nor defensive, it was simply matter of fact, and it struck a chord in the courtroom. Judge Reynolds sighed deeply, rubbing his temple as if to dispel the growing unease. It was clear that the case was no longer the straightforward affair he had assumed. But Caleb was not finished. With measured determination, he stepped forward once more. Your Honor, I would like to introduce into evidence an official statement from the registered owner of the vehicle, Mr. Nathaniel Carter. The judge frowned at the sudden twist, and Caleb continued without pause. Mr. Carter provided a statement to the police on the night his car was reported stolen, a statement that, for reasons unknown, was never included in the prosecution's filings. Mr. Carter told officers, I left my car running when I ran into a gas station. Some kid must have jumped in and taken off. But it wasn't the man you arrested. I saw the kid, and he was white. A collective gasp rose from the gallery. Caleb held up the printed transcript of the original police report for all to see. This is the very report the prosecution conveniently left out, he declared. Judge Reynolds, the arresting officer, admitted this detail, yet it was ignored when presenting evidence to the jury. Edward Hughes stuttered, attempting to regain control. This is irrelevant, he insisted, but Caleb shook his head calmly. I wasn't in the vehicle. I wasn't near the car. I was arrested blocks away from where the vehicle was abandoned, simply walking home after grabbing a bite with friends. The only thing connecting me to this case is poor police work and unwarranted assumptions. The tension was now almost unbearable. Judge Reynolds exhaled slowly, his face etched with the realization that the case was rapidly unraveling. Does the prosecution have any further evidence? He asked in a low, measured tone. Hughes' face turned a shade of red as he stammered, No, Your Honor. After a long pause, Judge Reynolds leaned forward, his voice resonating in the silent courtroom, case dismissed. A stunned silence filled the room before chaos erupted, half the gallery in disbelief, the other half in quiet relief. Reporters began scribbling furiously as cameras flashed. Caleb did not rush, he let the gravity of the moment sink in. As he headed for the door, Judge Reynolds stopped him. Mr. Monroe, he said slowly, you should consider law school. Caleb smirked in response, knowing full well that he had already charted his own course. Outside, the courthouse steps became a maelstrom of flashing cameras and probing questions. Did you expect the judge to dismiss the case? A reporter shouted. How does it feel to outsmart a seasoned prosecutor? Caleb simply pulled his hoodie over his head and walked away, his mind not on the spectacle but on the deeper implications of what had just transpired. His mother, Denise Carter, waited anxiously at the bottom of the steps. For a moment, her face was unreadable, but then she shook her head with a half-smile and said, Boy, you scared me half to death. Caleb chuckled and scratched the back of his head, a silent acknowledgement of the risk he had taken. Even Judge Reynolds, now standing across the street by his car, wore an expression of reflective regret rather than arrogance. In that brief courtroom showdown, Caleb had not only unmasked the flaws in a rigged system but had also forced everyone present from the judge to the jury to question the very nature of justice. It wasn't just about one case, it was about the systemic bias and shortcuts that lead to wrongful convictions. And as the day drew to a close, one thing was abundantly clear, the battle for a fair legal system had only just begun. Part 2, When a traffic stop becomes a turning point. Not far from the dramatic courtroom showdown, another story was unfolding in Sacramento, one that would forever alter the balance of power within a police department. As the late afternoon sun bathed the city in golden hues, Dylan Brooks was driving home in his well-maintained sedan after a long day at work. The hum of the engine and the soft strains of his favorite radio station provided a soothing backdrop to what he believed would be a routine drive. Dylan slowed at a yellow light, his eyes casually scanning the familiar intersection. But within seconds, flashing blue and red lights appeared in his rearview mirror, accompanied by the sharp wail of a police siren. He pulled over as instructed. Moments later, Officer Ryan Matthews, a man in his mid-30s with a buzz cut and a badge that gleamed under the setting sun, stepped out of his cruiser with a self-assured stride. "License and registration, please," Officer Matthews said, his tone curt yet laced with an underlying note of authority. Dylan reached into his glove compartment and retrieved his documents with measured calm. Although his hands moved deliberately, his mind raced with the realization that something was off about the interaction. As he handed over his driver's license and registration, he couldn't help but notice the steely, almost predatory gaze of Officer Matthews. After scrutinizing Dylan's documents, Matthews leaned in a bit closer. "Are you new around here?" he asked abruptly. Dylan, maintaining his composure, replied, "I moved here a few months ago. My address is on the license." But it was clear that Matthews was not interested in mundane answers. There was a subtle shift in his posture, an unmistakable edge to his questions. "Where were you headed in such a hurry?" he pressed further. Dylan's voice remained even as he answered, "I was just heading home." Yet, it soon became apparent that this wasn't just about a minor traffic infraction. Officer Matthews' tone grew increasingly invasive, his questions taking on a tone that hinted at suspicion beyond a simple failure to stop completely at a light. As the exchange continued, Dylan noticed how Matthews began to treat him less like an ordinary motorist and more like a suspect, someone he assumed had something to hide. The officer's scrutiny became relentless. "Step out of the car, please," Matthews ordered, his tone brooking no argument. Dylan's grip tightened on the steering wheel for a moment, but he complied calmly. Stepping out, he maintained a dignified posture. Dylan's appearance, tailored suit, polished shoes, and a confident demeanor did not match the rough-and-tumble stereotype that Matthews seemed to expect. Despite this, Matthews' eyes never stopped scrutinizing him. "Is there a specific reason for this stop?" Dylan asked in a measured tone as he moved to stand beside his car. Matthews, his expression hardening, replied with a hint of smugness, "It's routine. We've had some incidents around here, and I can't be too careful." Yet there was an undercurrent of something more, a need to assert control over the situation at any cost. Dylan's calm presence was unyielding. Sensing the rising tension, he inquired softly, "Are you sure this is just about a routine check?" His tone was both curious and challenging, a subtle invitation for Officer Matthews to explain himself without the usual bravado. Matthews, clearly irked by the question, snapped back, "Watch your tone." His voice was low, almost growling, as he gestured for Dylan to place his hands on the hood of the car so he could conduct a search. For a brief moment, Dylan's eyes widened in incredulity. "Do I look like I'm carrying a weapon?" he asked, his voice laced with disbelief but remaining calm. Matthews' jaw tightened, and his authoritative mask faltered ever so slightly as he repeated his demand. With a resigned sigh, Dylan complied, slowly placing his palms flat against the cool metal of his car's hood. Matthews then began to pat Dylan down. His movements were rough and overly meticulous, as if he were trying to extract a confession through intimidation. Yet Dylan remained stoic, every muscle relaxed, every movement deliberate. The silence between them was electric, charged with an intensity that neither party fully acknowledged. After completing the search, Matthews muttered under his breath, "You seem clean." But his voice carried a tone of reluctant admission, a grudging recognition that he hadn't found anything to justify his aggressive behavior. Dylan stepped closer, meeting Matthews' eyes with quiet determination. "Officer Matthews," he said steadily, I've had my fair share of encounters with law enforcement. I understand my rights, and I expect to be treated fairly." The confrontation escalated as Matthews, visibly irritated, edged closer into Dylan's personal space. "You seem to think you know everything," he snapped. "Are you a lawyer or something?" Dylan only offered a slight, knowing smile in response. "Let's just say I've learned a lot over the years," he replied, his tone measured but layered with meaning. It was then that Dylan did something unexpected. He reached into his pocket with deliberate slowness and pulled out a small, worn leather wallet. With a quiet air of authority, he flipped it open to reveal a gleaming badge. "I'm Dylan Brooks," he said, his voice calm as a settled storm, "and I head the Internal Affairs Division for the Sacramento Police Department." For an interminable moment, Officer Matthews' face registered pure disbelief. The confident, self-assured officer seemed to crumble before Dylan's quiet yet undeniable authority. "Internal Affairs?" Matthews echoed, his voice faltering as he struggled to process the revelation. "Yes," Dylan confirmed softly. "I oversee officer conduct, ensuring that those entrusted with a badge act with integrity and respect." The atmosphere around the car shifted palpably. Matthews' previously smug expression dissolved into one of uncertainty, and his body language sagged with the weight of his exposed misjudgment. With a low, resigned tone, he retrieved Dylan's documents and handed them back with trembling hands. I apologize," he murmured, his voice barely audible. Dylan accepted his documents without a word, tucking them away as he stepped back toward his car. Before climbing back in, he fixed Matthews with one final, piercing look. "Remember, Officer Matthews," he said quietly, "a badge doesn't make one above accountability, it holds you to a higher standard." With that, Dylan slid into his car and started the engine, leaving a stunned and chastened Matthews standing in the fading light. Later that evening, back at the Sacramento Police Department, Dylan sat at his desk as the early morning light filtered through the blinds. A file lay open before him, the subject a dossier on Officer Matthews, a record marred by minor complaints, excessive stops, and vague accusations that had never been properly addressed. As Dylan carefully reviewed the file, his mind churned with the broader implications of what had just occurred. It wasn't merely a case of one officer's misconduct, it was emblematic of a system that too often swept problems under the rug. A knock on the door broke Dylan's train of thought. His assistant, Linda, stepped in with a stack of reports. "Mr. Brooks, I have the summary on last month's misconduct cases," she said softly. "Also, Chief Anderson would like a meeting this afternoon." Dylan nodded, his mind already racing ahead to the changes that needed to be made. "Thank you, Linda. Please schedule that meeting with the chief right away," he replied, his tone resolute. As Linda left, Dylan turned his attention back to Officer Matthews' file. His expression was grim. He knew that this incident was not isolated. It was a symptom of a deeper, systemic problem, a culture that had long allowed unchecked authority and discrimination to flourish. Later that afternoon, in a stark, brightly lit conference room, Dylan sat across from Chief Anderson. The chief, a seasoned veteran with salt and pepper hair and an air of quiet authority, listened intently as Dylan recounted the traffic stop in meticulous detail. "I could have dismissed the encounter as just another bad interaction," Dylan said, his voice steady and purposeful. "But that would have been a mistake. Officer Matthews' behavior isn't an isolated incident. It reflects a broader problem, a failure in our training, our accountability, and our commitment to fairness." Chief Anderson rubbed his temples and sighed heavily. "This isn't the first time we've had complaints about Matthews," he admitted. "We've handled it quietly in the past." Dylan leaned forward, his eyes intense. "Quiet doesn't fix anything, Chief. Quiet lets the problem fester and repeat. We need to face these issues head-on. It's time for a comprehensive review of our protocols and a change in our culture." The conversation grew animated as Dylan outlined a plan for a department-wide review, a plan that would hold every officer accountable and demand transparency in every interaction with the public. In the weeks that followed, the entire department was abuzz with change. Dylan spearheaded meetings, conducted interviews, and even held public forums where community members could voice their concerns directly. The incident with Officer Matthews became a catalyst for reform, a turning point that forced the department to confront uncomfortable truths about bias and abuse of power. Meanwhile, Officer Matthews faced an internal hearing. In the tense, sterile atmosphere of the disciplinary board, Matthews' earlier bravado was nowhere to be seen. Dylan sat across from him during the proceedings, his presence a constant reminder of the day's events. Though the hearing eventually resulted in a suspension for Matthews, Dylan knew that the true victory was not in punishing one man, but in igniting a process that would prevent future injustices. A few months later, Dylan found himself standing at the podium during a community event. The room was filled with local residents, city officials, and fellow officers, all gathered to discuss the changes underway in the department. "Justice isn't just about catching the bad guys," Dylan declared, his voice resonant and earnest. "It's about ensuring that those entrusted with power act with integrity, fairness, and respect. Our badge is not a symbol of superiority, it's a promise of accountability." His words drew thunderous applause, and as he stepped down, Dylan could see in the faces around him both skepticism and hope. He knew that change wouldn't come overnight, but that together, they were on the path to building a department and a community grounded in true justice. Both Caleb Monroe's courtroom showdown and Dylan Brooks' transformative traffic stops serve as powerful reminders that the systems we rely on are run by people, and that when these people choose to stand up for what's right, they spark change. Whether it's a young man outsmarting a biased judicial system or an internal affairs officer holding his colleagues to a higher standard, these stories challenge us to question, to reflect, and to act. They remind us that the fight for fairness is ongoing. The courtroom may dismiss a case on a technicality, and a routine traffic stop might escalate into a moment of reckoning, but it is precisely these moments that reveal the cracks in the system. They urge us to look closer, to demand transparency, and to hold every individual accountable, because when people in positions of power are forced to face their own mistakes, real change is possible. If these stories made you think even for a second, if they stirred something inside you, then share them. Let us start conversations that matter. Subscribe for more narratives that challenge our assumptions and inspire us to strive for a justice system that works for everyone. Remember, the next time it might not be Caleb or Dylan, it could be someone you know.